The 2nd century BC was one of the most explosive eras in the rise of the Roman Empire. While victory in the Punic Wars of the preceding 3rd century may have seen Rome dispatch its greatest rival in the Western Mediterranean, a vast empire yet loomed to the east. Helmed by a great king, Antiochus III, who had campaigned from the hinterlands of Thrace to the rivers of India, it stood as the final triumvir of Alexander the Great's wars of succession. Now, each rival faced off in an uneasy showdown as the gods of war sowed the seeds of a brewing conflict. Between them lay the land of the Greeks, which would prove to be the bloody wrestling match for these two superpowers. The clashes to come would be some of the most incredible, yet forgotten battles of antiquity. They include a repeat of the legendary fight at Thermopylae, a massive 100,000-man brawl in the plains of Magnesia, and an epic sea battle featuring none other than Hannibal Barca, Nightmare of Rome, at the helm of a Greek fleet. This is the story of the Seleucid War. Now, over the many years of making these documentaries, I've actually moved quite a bit. With each setup and teardown, it's meant that pieces of furniture, like my bed frame, have been falling apart progressively. Screws coming loose, fasteners missing, things like that. And the experience was just not great. So I've been on the market for quite a bit now, looking for a bed that was good quality, but still affordable. And that's when I found FlexiSpot's Kana Japanese joinery bed, and it turned out to be exactly what I was looking for, and more. What really sold me on this bed is the Japanese joinery design. Instead of relying on a bunch of screws and hardware that can loosen over time, the pieces all interlock together with precise precision and tension, no tools needed. Everything is well designed and fits snugly together like a giant puzzle. The end result is a bed that feels incredibly stable and solid. No creaking, no wobbling, no constant need for tightening. The frame itself is made from solid rubber wood, which is a strong hardwood known for its durability. It's finished with a scratch-resistant and moisture-resistant coating, so it holds up really well to everyday use and still looks great over time. You can really tell that this product was made to last, and it comes with a lot of smart design features that are really good for your everyday uses. For instance, the slats are secured with Velcro so they don't slide around or make noise while you sleep. The inward recessed legs allow the bed to sit close on the wall, giving it a clean, flush look and adding extra stability. And with over 10 inches of under-bed clearance, there's plenty of room for storage bins, extra blankets, or seasonal items, which is a huge bonus if you're short on space. Another thing I really appreciate is just how customizable it all is. On the FlexiSpot website, you can choose different finishes, add matching pieces like headboards, nightstands, or even an adjustable backrest, so you can at the end of the day have a setup that fits your space and your lifestyle. Overall, once this was set up, the difference was immediate. My room felt calmer, quieter, and more put together. The bed looks clean and minimalist, feels rock solid, and honestly offers better value than a lot of more expensive frames out there. So if you're like me and want something that's easy to assemble, quieter, sturdier, looks great, and doesn't break the bank, then this is the bed for you. So click the link below to experience a FlexiSpot bed frame for yourself. Don't miss out and use our exclusive code Invicta for an instant discount. So act now to transform your sleep with comfort, convenience, and unmatched value. The Roman Seleucid War often goes forgotten as a conflict which falls through the historical gaps of far more well-known events such as the prior Punic Wars and the ensuing Roman Civil Wars. Perhaps adding further to its low profile is the nature of its unfolding, having less to do with grand, bombastic invasions, and more to do with slow-burning, multi-party geopoliticking. Yet it is these very characteristics which, at least to me, make it so fascinating. With this disclaimer in mind, let us now set the stage for this most intriguing of plays. At the beginning of the 2nd century BC, the Mediterranean world experienced an odd period of stillness. In the west, a nascent empire had bloomed, the young but powerful Republic of Rome. She had just emerged bloodied, exhausted, but ultimately victorious from a grand wrestling match with the former superpower of the West, Carthage. With the Second Punic War over, the North African threat now bowed to her Italian overlords. In the east, meanwhile, the greatest of the successor states had brought its power to bear. In an echo of Alexander, a king had emerged who now too was honored as the Great while he still lived. His name was Antiochus III, ruler of the lands from the Levant to the borders of India. He was a brilliant politician, a cunning general, and a geopolitical mastermind. With an iron fist and silken tongue, Antiochus had taken on the Herculean challenge of reassembling the vast, fractured empire of his forebears. Over the course of his reign, the great king had put down rebellion, marshaled wavering subjects, and delicately balanced a web of alliances. He had campaigned all the way to the Indus River and returned, wresting away control of Syria from Ptolemaic Egypt and conquering Parthia in the process. Piece by piece, the lands of Alexander the Great were reassembled. Finally, after years of toil, it arose from the ashes of the successor wars as a phoenix by the name of the Seleucid Empire. Between these two great states of the East and West would be a number of lesser states whose fates would weave an entangling thread between their neighbors. Of most relevance to our story today would be those which occupied the sweeping expanse of the Hellenic world. Much of the coast of Asia Minor and the Aegean was composed of independent Greek city-states. Each was extremely loud and proud of this supposed freedom, though in reality, each city's existence often relied on external guarantors. This weakness was one which the Romans eagerly exploited as a means of further expanding their control. It would thus be as a claimed liberator that the Romans waged war upon Macedon in 200 BC and Sparta in 195 BC. Yet each intervention in the name of freedom seemed to only further weaken the powers of the Hellenic world. The Roman peace treaty with Macedon in 196 BC was one such example. Macedon, which was once seen as the shield against the barbarian tribes of Dacia, was now humbled and allowed an army of no more than 5,000 men and 6 ships for the task. Antiochus was much less concerned about the general affairs of mainland Greece. At least for now, he busied himself with establishing control over Asia Minor, pressing ancestral claims to Thrace, and taking full advantage of the dwindling power of Ptolemaic Egypt. Thus far, Antiochus had taken control of his rival's northernmost holdings, but had been unable to press his advantage. For now, the sword thrust into his rival's core had been deflected at the Battle of Raphia in 217 BC. It was here that a massive confrontation with over 150,000 combatants and hundreds of war elephants saw the army of the Seleucids turn back with heavy losses from Egypt proper. Yet the grand empire of Antiochus had vast resources with which to out-attrition its southern rival. A feebler Egypt was in no state to fight Antiochus in a prolonged war. The next blow was therefore inevitable, but its timing would be carefully chosen by a prudent Antiochus. Such an opportunity arose in 204 BC when Ptolemy IV died and was succeeded by his 5-year-old son Ptolemy V. The boy had no chance to think before attacks started piling up onto Egyptian borders. It was equally unhelpful that his successive regents were incredibly incompetent. So it came to be that Egypt was desperately attempting to court the attentions of both Rome and the Seleucids, tacitly acknowledging the superiority of both while attempting to secure its own borders. Antiochus could have used this moment to lead an army of overwhelming strength to finally crush the Ptolemies. However, he calculated that such a maneuver would be time and resource intensive. Thus, ever the pragmatic ruler, he instead entered diplomatic negotiations, which ultimately culminated in a marriage between his daughter and the young pharaoh. In this way, his hostile foe was made his subservient friend. Rome, meanwhile, was in a particularly delicate position in 196 BC. While much of the western Mediterranean bowed to Rome's imperium, most of those states had also been in open conflict with Rome within living memory. Carthage, for instance, now a puppet, had won several victories against the empire that would have crippled any other. Macedon chafed at the terms of their recently imposed treaty and were ignoring many of its provisions. Illyria, Aitolia, Sparta, Achaea, Syracuse, and the various tribes of Gaul and Spain were in a constant state of uprising. Even within Italy, there was unrest. Not all cities had been loyal to Rome when Hannibal came knocking, and the Samnites were an ever-present domestic dissident. Neither Rome nor Antiochus were interested in a war. Both sides acknowledged the strength of the other, and both were respectful of the boundaries of power that were set. Antiochus even sent an embassy to Rome in 195 BC to make a declaration of friendship. Unfortunately, unforeseen events would soon conspire to turn this olive branch into a seed for war. First and foremost was political turmoil in Carthage. Hannibal, the great general and once favored savior of his people, had been forced to flee into exile by his own city, not by any Roman threats or coercion. No, Instead, he had attempted to play the politician, but after a certain amount of time, his luster dimmed. The Carthaginians were interested in peace now, not his bellicose rhetoric and nature. Unfortunately for him, his exile was a dangerous thing. The entire region of the Mediterranean around him was surrounded by loyalists to Rome and those seeking its favor, and any one of them might take his head. Egypt would offer no protection, and the so-called independent states of Greece would betray him as soon as it was in their individual best interest. There was only one place where he might find shelter from Rome's long reach, one place that might even listen to the counsel of a general on Rome's most wanted list: the court of Antiochus the Great. However, at the very same time that Rome's boogeyman departed for the east, Seleucid ambassadors set off for the west. Thus, as these emissaries crossed paths, unwittingly rehearsing their speeches for an anticipated meeting before the Senate, Rome had already been set ablaze with a frenzy of rumors regarding Hannibal's latest move. Should they interpret it as a sign of inevitable hostility? An insult? How much influence would Hannibal have over the decisions of the Seleucids? Was it a coincidence that this had all happened just as Rome was removing her troops from Greece? Was Antiochus' continued war in Thrace just a front to allow him to attack Greece more easily? How large were the ambitions of this great king really? This atmosphere of panicked distrust apparently confused the Seleucid emissaries as they arrived before the Senate. As Livy describes, quote, Menippus and Hegesianax were the leaders of the embassy, and the former was the spokesman. He professed himself at a loss to understand what difficulty or complications his missions could create, as he had simply come to ask that friendly relations might be established and an alliance formed. After apparently returning to his pre-rehearsed speech, the envoy went on to explain that there were three kinds of treaties one might rightfully consider in this moment: one between victor and vanquished, one between evenly matched enemies, and one between respectful non-combatants. He elaborated, quote, This third class of treaties comprises those made by states which have never been enemies, and who unite in forming a league of friendship. No conditions are either imposed or accepted, for these only exist between victors and vanquished. It was this latter kind of league that Antiochus was seeking, and that he, the speaker, was surprised that the Romans should think it just and fair to impose conditions upon the king as to which of the cities in Asia they decided should be free and autonomous, and which should pay tribute, and in the case of some, forbidding the king to garrison them. These were terms on which to make peace with Philip, their enemy, not a treaty of alliance with Antiochus, who was their friend. Yet an agitated Senate dug in its heels. They demanded a firm partition between Roman Europe and Seleucid Asia, even knowing that Antiochus was currently, in this very time, in the third year of a campaign to press his ancestral claims to the lands of Thrace, very much on the European continent. Rome's demand was an impossible one for the emissaries to accept either way. Rome had never made such a bold, presumptive, far-reaching line in the sand with anyone before, completely surprising the king's ambassadors. But finally, in true Roman fashion, a senator named Galba broke in with an ultimatum. The king must cede Thrace, or else. Menippus, who again had come to these talks with the best possible intentions and with no authority to deal with such ultimatums, was forced to abandon the talks and head home empty-handed. Antiochus' reaction was quick and defensive. He withdrew his forces immediately from Thrace into Anatolia and finalized the marriage of his daughter, named Cleopatra I, to the ruler of Egypt. Rome, following diplomatic tradition, sent its own embassy as a follow-up. The embassy was headed by 3 former consuls, some of the most distinguished men of Rome, who were not particularly friendly towards the Seleucids. One of them was the very same Galba who had laid an ultimatum at the feet of Menippus. It's good to note here that neither the Senate nor Antiochus was actually looking for war. It would benefit neither of them, and it was in the best interest of both to have a positive and stable diplomatic relationship with each other. Unfortunately for the great powers, peace was not in the best interest of the various small city-states between them. Those of Anatolia saw Rome as an excellent foil to Antiochus. If they were allied with Rome, then they would have an edge when negotiating with their Seleucid overlords. In mainland Greece, meanwhile, the city-states were similarly at work, scheming on how to leverage matters to their advantage. One should remember that the only thing that the Greeks hated more than other Greeks was any power that tried to establish some sort of order amid their chaotic existence. It didn't help then that each one was just as fiercely proud of its own independence as the next. Essentially,
it was similar to a horde of young children in the backseat of a car on a 12-hour drive. The bickering was petty, complex, and predictably ridiculous. As Rome began slowly withdrawing its troops that had been left over from the war with Macedon, the Greek city-states tried to take their chances at testing the patience of Rome. The first was Sparta, who had used the Roman war with Macedon as an excuse to play both sides, seizing control of Argos along the way. The Achaean League complained to Rome about Sparta after the war, and Rome sided against Sparta. The Achaeans, after all, had been on Rome's side since the beginning, while Sparta had only flipped to the Roman side after seizing the strategically crucial city of Argos. Rome showed little mercy for such duplicity. Thus, together with the other Greek powers, they waged the Laconian War against the Spartans. In 195 BC, this conflict saw the allies initially test the Spartan garrison which held Argos before simply bypassing it to invade Laconia by land and sea. These two pincer forces converge on the fortified port of Gythium, seizing it and raiding the surrounding lands before turning to the capital itself. Here the Spartans held out behind the newly constructed walls of their city. While they managed to hold out for several days, Rome and her allies eventually breached the walls and stormed the city. As legions advanced down the streets, the defenders desperately set fire to their own buildings. This bought them a moment's respite against the attack, but ultimately, the doom of the city was already sealed. When King Naves surrendered, Sparta was stripped of virtually all its territory and reduced to a subservient member of the Achaean League. But as always occurs in Greece, peace rarely lasts. Soon, it was the Aetolians who entered the picture. During the war with Macedon, which had only been a year or two before this, they had been staunch allies to Rome to help to beat down Macedon. Yet now, they were petulantly displeased with how things had turned out. Apparently Rome had been relatively benevolent towards Macedon since the treaty was signed, and Aitolia wanted blood. Not only that, but they realized that, besides the independence they had gained, they had really not made many more strides forward since the Roman victory. And so, of course, they started scheming for additional ways to gain an advantage over their neighbors. First, they demanded far harsher terms towards Macedon, which they knew Rome would dismiss out of hand. Then, they started sending emissaries to Antiochus, complaining about Roman overreach and requesting his arbitration. Antiochus mostly ignored them, of course, but the gesture had been made. By doing this, the Aetolians had suggested that the Romans were not fit to maintain their grip on Greece, and an outsider needed to step in. The Aetolians knew exactly how provocative this was, and that Rome could not necessarily respond militarily without insulting and provoking the Seleucids. So Rome tried to take the diplomatic route. Flaminius, the administrator of Greek affairs, tried to claim that, as an ally of Rome, Aetolia was obligated to bring its objections to the Senate first. That was simply not the case, and it just added fuel to the fire. Apparently, being an ally of Rome was now the same thing as being her subject. Merely this suggestion infuriated the Aetolians, who promptly began taking their frustrations not on powerful Rome, but on nearby Sparta. Sparta, who had just recently been crushed by Rome, was hard-pressed to defend itself and appealed to Rome as their overlord for aid. Unable to secure the swift victory they had expected against the Spartans, though, the Aetolians now recalled their troops before any serious Roman intervention could occur. But not to be daunted, they now began planning something far more ominous. That plot took place as a mass uprising against Roman dominance over all of Greece. After signing a peace treaty with Sparta, Aetolia planned a three-pronged assault, attacking the cities known as the fetters of Greece. These included the cities of Demetrius, Corinth, and Chalcis, which were the most strategically well-placed, and the power that controlled them could easily exert control over the entire peninsula. For now, Corinth was firmly within Achaean territory, but the other two were controlled by Macedon, and by proxy, Rome. So Aetolia planned to attack both Demetrius and Chalcis. A third target was added, which was Sparta, with whom Aetolia had only just signed a treaty of peace. Nonetheless, the plans moved forward. First, the Aetolians bought and used an exiled politician to gain access to Demetrius, which quickly declared its loyalty to the Aetolians. The attack on Chalcis, though, was bungled by the person in charge. He insisted on an overly complex plot that was inevitably leaked to the rulers of the city. In response, the rulers of Chalcis simply locked the gates on the attempted infiltration, leaving the Aetolians to wring their hands from outside. The plot on Sparta, though, was perhaps the one which went the most sideways. The Aetolians succeeded at first in storming the city itself, assassinating the king and looting the palace. So far so good. However, this short-term victory turned out to be a disaster. The Spartans rallied around the young son of the former king and slaughtered the Aetolians to the man. This also proved an excellent propaganda victory for the Roman allies, and with the spectacular failures at Chalcis, painted the Aetolians as treacherous and greedy. The Aetolians, though, considered it to be a relative success. After all, their top goal was to undermine the stability of Greece, and therefore to undermine the confidence in Greece's Italian overlords. Even though the instability was purely caused by them, it was nonetheless instability, which was in their favor. In this plot, they had strategically made their friendship known towards the Seleucids, and, as an independent state, they could make the claim now that any move against them was merely an attempt by Rome to quell Greek freedom in general. In doing so, Aitolia had brought the landscape to the brink of war, and most troublingly of all, Antiochus had now indicated his tacit approval of these events by resuming his campaigns in European Thrace. The powder keg was primed to blow, and Aitolia was playing with matches. Stay tuned for our next episode as we continue the exploration of the unfolding and exploding of the Seleucid Wars. For now, you can join us on Patreon or YouTube memberships to catch script previews and download our art. A big thanks to the current supporters, and a shout out to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.